Go ahead and be turning to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Where we're going to spend the majority of our time this morning. Good to have the number that we do this morning. We have a great number present. Some that have been out, some that are with us again, some that are still away from us, and certainly keep those in your prayers. But good to be with you this morning. We have a beautiful day. Every day is a beautiful day. First day of the week to come together to worship, to think on those things that are righteous and good. Last week, middle of the morning worship and the singing, we had the chance, some of us, to go and visit a little longer with one another, visit on things that perhaps we don't have enough time to do, things that we can't really do in this assembly, but we can do in other ways. And some of us had a brief conversation about the book of Ecclesiastes, and that kind of spurred on some previous studies that I had done, and I kind of haven't looked at those in a while. I said, well, maybe now's a good time to do that. Kind of got the cogs turning a little bit. In the book of Ecclesiastes, this is a book that is rather pessimistic. If you leave out the last few passages of the book, it can be a big downer. It can be rather depressing, dark, and the writer of the book, King Solomon, seems a bit jaded in what he's talking about here. But that pessimism, as we'll see this morning, eventually leads to hope. It leads to something that has purpose. And it is a book that does offer a lot of sympathy to the person who says, this is a miserable, awful, no good, broken world. Solomon says, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. He spends the majority of the book talking about the worthlessness of the world and of what it brings to the table, of what the world brings to the table. But by the end of the book, he offers up something he offers up some wisdom, rather, of who is able to bring some hope, to bring some meaning, to bring some purpose into our lives, of what the world can't do. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, in verse 13, it reads, "And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised." If you're using the English Standard Version, it might read, "This is an unhappy business that God has given to man." And I think that's a pretty good summation of the book, of what Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes. All that Solomon observes around him, all that he sees, none of it's great. It's not great at all. And there are so many burdens, there are so many weights that do bring us down in our lives. Maybe you don't think that way. You may not think that way. And this book is certainly helpful for those who are in the pit, for those that do feel that way. But for those who don't think that way, I don't really, I'm more of an optimistic person. I'm not so pessimistic. What Solomon is going to do is he's going to take those colorful bubbles in your life and he's going to burst every single one of them. He's going to bring you down to earth, quite literally. He's going to pull back the curtain and show you just how bad the world is. All that is under the sun is broken. It is hopeless. And so that is what we observe. The world is a broken, mangled place. And Solomon observes, things aren't getting bad. In fact, the world has been mangled. It has been broken since the very beginning, since Genesis chapter 3. The world has always, since nearly the very beginning, it's been miserable. It's been full of mean, sadistic, wicked people. And there have been wars and conflicts and hate, except for 2 chapters of the book. And then we get to chapter 3, and the rest of the Bible story and the rest of the story of humanity is full of that stuff. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1 in verse 3. Solomon says, "What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun?" So perhaps here, this is a hearkening back to the curse that was laid on man in the garden. The work that we perform as mankind, we do the labor that we do after the curse. It's hard. It's hard labor. And we continually do it. We have to continue doing it. It's not that it's a hard job. It's like, man, I'm glad that's over with. Well, something harder perhaps is going to come along after that. So there's more frustration there, and there's less payoff because of our sin, because of the curse that was laid to us in the garden. And thinking about garden terminology, whenever you plant a garden, you plow, you make the necessary preparations, you put in that hard work, and you do that once, and everything's set for the rest of your life, right? No, you have to do that year in and year out, and really throughout the entire season, weeding out the garden, doing that hard labor. That is something that we have to live with because of sin entering the world. One of the things that Abby has observed that she hates since our marriage is laundry. As soon as she gets done with one big load of laundry, she looks over and there's another pile waiting for her. Like, why? It's every day having to do the laundry. And that's right. It's just a continual cycle, just even these menial things that, we in America, it's first world problems, right? Well, in our little bubble of America, it can be easy for us to not appreciate some of the hard things that the majority of the world has to deal with. But again, as many books in the Bible do, Solomon pulls back that curtain and he gives us a look into and some insight into what all goes on in the world. One of the phrases that's repeated over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes, as I'm sure most of us know, all is vanity. This is vanity. That is vanity. And I could, instead of the title that I did give, if you've seen The Princess Bride, right, there's a lot of quotable lines in that film. You might say, instead of life is pain, highness, life is vain, highness. Anyone who says otherwise is selling you something. People will try to offer encouragement, as in, oh, just look for the sunshine, just look for the good things, look for the silver lining. Look for those small moments that give you that little pick-me-up. The ones that offer that, they only offer that with earthly wisdom and really just kind of on-the-wall wisdom, whether that's Facebook wisdom, as somebody's just doing a quick quote, or in the wall of a home, wall of your office. Hang in there, you got this. And it doesn't really do any good for that person without some extra reinforcement, right? That's not really going to get us through all of life's problems. And we find as we go through life, we are going to become very frustrated by the thought that it doesn't have to be that way. Have you ever heard somebody tell you that? It doesn't have to be this way. Look over at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. You'll hear this phrase thrown around quite a bit of, it doesn't have to be this way. You'll hear that thrown around in politics in particular. The solution that politicians will give to a problem they observe might in fact be worse than the problem itself. People cry out, what are you going to do about this? And they give the solution and they say, no, that's not the direction we want to go in. And so even people with a lot of influence, with a lot of power and capability, they miss the mark themselves even. And they are limited in what they are able to change. Look at Ecclesiastes 8, beginning in verse 16. Solomon says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the works of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. I have the answer. I have the answer to all of your problems. I know exactly what to do. If you hear somebody saying that, be very careful. Because as we observe here, Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, of course, aside from Christ himself, is saying, guys, look at me. I have all wisdom, and I didn't figure it out. I couldn't do it. So somebody says that, someone who is much less wise than Solomon says, I have all of the answers. Solomon says, no, you don't. I'll save you the trouble. I've been there. I've done that. It ain't going to work. You can't fix everything that's crooked. Man cannot do that. We are not capable of it. And even Solomon, who was more capable than any of us ever will be of changing these things, of fixing this world, he felt helpless at what he did see. Look over at chapter 4 in verse 1. Chapter 4 and verse 1. He says, Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Solomon could actually do something for the oppressed, for the ones who were in pain. And he says, I can't fix this, at least not permanently. I can't permanently fix this broken world. There's nothing I can do about that. He could do some good, and we'll see that through some of the book. And it's not to say we don't do any good. But whatever good King Solomon could do, what's to stop a foolish king that comes after him to come and undo all of the good that he did? And he makes that point actually later on in Ecclesiastes, or earlier actually in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 18. We'll look at this passage and kind of look at it in jest, kind of jokingly. In chapter 2 and verse 18, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. So I can put in all this work, I can put in all this effort, but at the end of the day, I'm going to die and all my possessions are going to go to somebody else. And maybe even the point of all of the good that I've accomplished in setting good and righteous things on the table, somebody's just going to come after me and he's going to undo that. What's the point? He says, I can't fix this. And Solomon, with that, he crushes the idea of the vision of the anointed. The vision of the anointed, if you haven't heard of that terminology, it's an idea that says if we search hard and long enough, we can find the best and the brightest, kind of like Nebuchadnezzar was doing with Daniel and his friends. Find the best and the brightest, and we can solve all of the world's problems. We can solve this crisis. We can fix this to improve the lives of others. Look at Ecclesiastes 1:16 beginning. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Solomon again says, this is vanity. This is grasping for the wind. Now, Solomon does offer up the idea here that wisdom is better than folly. Earthly wisdom can get you to some good things, but it's only going to take you so far. There's a ceiling to what that does. It's not going to, in fact, create utopia on earth, as so many might suggest. And again, somebody that suggests that, very careful. Very careful in listening to those people. Others in this world, and we ourselves, we can identify the problems of the world very easily. But Solomon, to use the words of Queen Sheba, who came to visit him at one point, to look at all that he had done, to borrow her words, Solomon might say, you don't know the half of how bad this world is. And then God might even come along after him and say, you don't know any of it. You don't know at all how bad this world is, how messed up it is. So we ought not to be shocked in finding that this world is broken, that it is a mess. Look over at chapter 5. Chapter 5 in verse 8. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. People will say, we live in an age of injustice. Injustice reigns. We live in a time of tyrants. You go outside of this bubble that we're in America, and you will find just how full the world is of injustice and tyrants. And you think injustice didn't exist during the time of Domitian and Nero, and Christians being persecuted then. You think it didn't exist during the time of Jeremiah as it pertained to earthly kings. It has always been this way since nearly the very beginning. Oppression, injustice, it has always persisted. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but it has always been there. You know, we in this country, we don't have to worry about so many things. We don't have to worry about our homes being shelled at a moment's notice. We don't have to worry about things that we repeat often of we're thankful for the food that's on the table, we're thankful for the clothes on our back. But really, when we think about that, we look at the world around us, even if we haven't lived in those environments, we can observe this world is broken. There is a lot of oppression, there is a lot of pain. And yet, we observe that we do have it better in this country. And yet, for all of that, we can still observe injustice in this country. We can observe inconsistencies in leadership. We see those things. And we don't have to look far, even in spite of the prosperity and the peace that we have in this country. But look at the time that Solomon lived in. Look no further for a time of peace and prosperity, the best that it's ever been. And yet, what does he observe? Injustice, oppression, pain. It's still there. It still exists. But I thought it was a time of peace. Well, that doesn't mean that there is no injustice. There is no pain. Even he couldn't get rid of all of it, no matter how much he tried. You know, people today, and they've always said this in theme with the book of Ecclesiastes, you can change the world. You yourself can change the world. Solomon says, no, you can't. Can't do it. There's no way you can. It's not possible. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we can't make any difference, that we can't do any good. But there is a ceiling to the good that we can do. You can only go up so many levels, and then you can't go past that. We are limited in what we can do. Somebody might say, well, if only people did this, this would fix the problem. Solomon says they ain't going to do it. It's not going to happen. They're not going to. Because this world is a broken, messed up place. And somebody might say, well, that's a pretty grim outlook on life. That's pretty pessimistic. It is. And Solomon wants you to see it that way. He wants you to see how broken this world is. You know, there's these ideas about paying it forward. If you've been in a drive-through before, and perhaps you've gotten up to the window and say, oh, the person behind you paid for your meal. Oh, that's nice. I'll pay for the person behind you. And hopefully it's only just a couple bucks. Maybe it's not like a $50, $60 transaction, you know. And so we look at that and we say, oh, that's so great. That really puts my faith in humanity. Solomon would come in and say, oh yeah, what about the next person? And the next person, and the next person, and the next person. And you say, you know, I helped out this person financially. They were in a bad spot and I helped them out, or you observed somebody doing that for somebody else. And Solomon says, what about the next day? Did you help them out then? You say, well, I can't do it every day. I'm limited in financially and what I can do. Exactly. That's what Solomon says. We are limited in the good that we can do. It's not that we can't do any good, but we are limited in what we can do. Solomon says that sun will set on the goodness. Your faith in humanity, don't put it there because it isn't going to last. There's not enough positivity in the world that can keep us above water long enough. Now, Solomon observes of all the brokenness that's in the world, he even sees the brokenness that's in his own life. Turn over to chapter 2. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 4. Solomon says, I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Verse 11. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed, what's the phrase? All was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. You might say in your own life, I'm a failure. Yes, you are. I'm a failure. We are all a failure. We have all failed. What's more dangerous is someone reaching the end of their life, looking at all they've accomplished, all that they've accumulated, and they say, I'm not a failure. I've done a lot of good stuff. I'm pretty great. Kind of reminds us of Luke chapter 12 and verse 19 with the rich man there that Jesus talks about. Self, you have done many good things. You have stored up many good things. Eat, drink, and be merry. That is a very dangerous outlook on life. And that person is a failure with that attitude. Solomon accomplished more than any of us ever will. He had all wisdom, all knowledge. And what is his evaluation of all that he had? The Queen of Sheba's jaw drops at everything that he had accumulated, all that he was able to accomplish. And yet, what does Solomon say? He says, I am a failure. I have failed. You can point to all of the stuff that you got. You can point to all of the things you've done in this life. But one day, again, we're all going to die. And as Solomon observes, that stuff's going to go to somebody else. And the things that you've done, eventually that's going to be forgotten by mankind. People aren't going to remember. Now, I hope I've brought you down at this point. And it would be incredibly depressing if I chose to end the sermon there this morning and I didn't continue further. But fortunately, that's not all life has to offer, at least not as it pertains to this world. So Solomon he's bursted all of our bubbles. We try to bring little rays of sunshine, silver linings. Solomon says, nope, take that away. What do you have? You have nothing. You have hopelessness. You take away what the world has to offer. But fortunately, Solomon says, there is one thing that does bring a remedy. There is one thing that does fix things. We find that God is truly our only hope. He is the answer to the question that Solomon is asking throughout the entire book. Look at chapter 1 and verse 15. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. Some of your translations might actually have that as a question, and this particular phrase is repeated in other places as a question. And I think that's actually a pretty good idea of what's happening here. Who can do this but God himself? Only God can permanently make what was broken whole again. Only God can bend back that which has been made crooked. He can make it straight again. Again, going back to what Solomon is illustrating here, the world offers up good things. And Solomon says, okay, take that away. What are you left with? Again, nothing, hopelessness, emptiness. But with God, we find that the smallest of things in life are hopeful. When we see this world is broken, every gift is savored with a little bit more gratitude, a lot more gratitude, in fact. Look at chapter 2 in verse 24. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. So now that God is in the picture, now that God is in our life, I can actually enjoy some of those small blessings that life has to offer. Otherwise, those small things, those small good things that are in our life, that's all we have. That's all we're holding on to. We're looking for those little moments of sunshine and those silver linings, but you know what? It's not going to last. Because again, this world is broken. It's messed up. And another way to frame it up, I don't deserve the simple pleasures in life. None of us do. None of us deserve those things. I don't deserve the food that I eat. It shouldn't taste that good. But God chose to make it that way, right? And so we frame it up that way. God gave me that. God gave me that simple pleasure. And so now, with that good thing in this life, I now have somewhere to direct my gratitude, to direct my thankfulness. So we look at those small things, and that gives us an opportunity to thank God. Now all of those things, all of those good little things that are sprinkled throughout life, it's surrounded with God, surrounded in the goodness of God. God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. And even when we observe that there is a gift from God, that's actually kind of even a blessing within a blessing. Anytime that we have an opportunity to observe good and to observe God is there, that is a pleasure. God is there. And that even should point us looking upward, right? God is there even in that small good thing in this life. But one day, we live in accordance with his will. We will reach that heavenly dwelling, and God will always be there. He is always there in his fullest and most perfect way. Well, also, when we bring God into the picture, we find that we are freed from burdens that we ourselves are not capable of carrying. Look over at chapter 3 in verse 12. Chapter 3 in verse 12 says, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. These verses here, this comes directly on the heels of the verses 2 through 8. There's a season for this, there's a time for this, a time for that. And it's the idea that you can't have the good without the bad, right? You can't take away the mourning, the wars, the destructions just because it's bad. It's going to be there because this world's broken. But what we can do is found in verse 12. We can live righteously, and we can be the good that we want to see in the world. We can be the good that we want to receive from others. We enjoy the gifts that God has given to us, and we acknowledge that it's a gift from him. So instead of trying to stick it to the man, instead of trying to change the world through these big corporations and organizations, and trying to expose the leaders in this world for the corruption that they have, be kind. Be kind to your fellow man. Be grateful to God and help out in that way. And of course, the verse talking about thesis statements, as we did in John this morning, In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13, what is the conclusion of the whole matter, but that we fear God and keep his commandments? What are we here for? Somebody might say, what's our purpose? This is our purpose. Somebody might say, well, that's not enough. That's not enough. There has to be something more. No, in fact, it is more than enough. It is more than enough. It always will be. His goodness is overflowing. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 19, this is a book that we've been going through in our Saturday reading. In Ephesians in 3 and verse 19, be filled with all the fullness of God. When we fear God and we keep his commandments, we find that his goodness truly is overflowing. Well, again, when we bring God into the picture, we find that it frees us from worrying about every little thing people might say against or about us. One of my favorite authors, aside from Tolkien, is actually one that is based in reality, not fantasy. David McCullough, which I think I've mentioned a few times in some sermons and classes. But he's a historical author, and one of his more famous books, written about John Adams, was turned into a show several years ago. Some of you might have seen, and it expertly and rather comically depicts the exchange and really the entire relationship that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had with one another. They were friends sometimes, but there was a period in their life where they hated each other. They really did not like each other at all. And during the middle of their presidential campaigns, there was a lot of mudslinging that was going on. And one of the things that Thomas Jefferson said about John Adams, and I'll read just this brief blurb. John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who is a hideous hermaphroditic character with neither the force and fitness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. That's pretty brutal. And aren't you glad that doesn't happen today? Aren't you glad we don't talk like that today? No, in fact, it's probably gotten worse, right? And aren't you glad that we don't have everybody's thought at a moment's glance, right? Got this. We get everybody's thoughts. We can type out our own thoughts in a few seconds without thinking about it. And that might start a big bonfire. That might start a big forest fire. And we can't take that back. So feelings are hurt. Names are drawn through the mud. And we get tired of that. We get tired of that nonsense. Solomon says, in thinking about retaliating to that, he says, don't do it. Stop it. Step away. It's not worth it. Going back to the last lesson of being in the world, not of the world. As much as depends on me, be at peace with all men. Again, that's a hard thing to do. Self-control. We can be in the world. We can observe all of those bad things that are happening, people that are trying to hurt us, but we can't be in the world and then throw it right back in their faces, right? Don't fight fire with fire. And part of how we can make that easier is, again, looking upward, keeping our eyes fixed on the goal, keeping our eyes fixed on heaven, and not wasting our time in those frivolous, worthless debates and arguments. Well, finally, we find that God, when he is in the picture, he is even capable of bringing beauty out of the mess that we do observe around us. Going back to Ecclesiastes 3 and the passage that we already read, Ecclesiastes 3, backing up a little bit in verse 9, Solomon says, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Beautiful in its time. That's the same word, beautiful, there, for in the beginning, God created the earth, and all of the things that he created, he saw that it was good. So he saw that it was beautiful. It's the same word for when Moses' parents saw Moses, and they saw that he was a beautiful child. He was a good child. Both of those words being used. God can take what is so messed up, what is so ugly, and he can turn it into something good. We can find the good in spite of the ugliness. Romans chapter 8 in verse 28 reads, Paul says there, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, those who are the called according to his purpose. If you love the Lord, then the tragedy of the world, the tragedy that might be in your life, the tragedy that you witness around you, it can be seen with light. Not just that you shed a light on the bad, but you can view that with a little bit of light. Even in the extreme, Job experienced everything under the sun, all of the tragedy that the world had to offer. And by the end of the book, Job observes, there is goodness here. There is goodness. Paul in the New Testament, because he comes to truly know who God is, instead of berating against the church and dragging Christians into the courts, into jail, killing some, he sees his past life, his sin, and he even finds goodness in that. Not that sin itself is good, but he can look at his past life and he can see the grace of God being worked out in his own life. And that is a beautiful picture. Even I can be forgiven, Paul says. And that is comforting for us. We can find the good. So because we see God for who he truly is, we can take on any of the darkness, any of the things of the world that are evil, and we can still see the light, because God, as we even observed this morning in John, is the light. And he provides that light. So just as the disciples did, we count it all joy when we fall into various trials. And we grow with that. We learn from those things and we find the good. But with God out of the picture, in the midst of tragedy, I wonder myself, how do people do that? How do people carry on without God? And the fact is, they don't do it well, because their life is full of emptiness. Their life is full of hopelessness. And you might say, I do have some hope in my life. Well, at the end of the day, Solomon would say that's a fool's hope. If you try to just get on with the world, the small things that happen that are good, it's not going to last. During my high school senior trip, we actually went up the East Coast, and we kind of skirted this area of the country. We didn't quite come through Charlottesville, but we went to DC for 1 or 2 days, and we went to the Holocaust Museum. And if you haven't been to the Holocaust Museum, I am of the opinion everyone should visit that once, and then you're done, because those images stay with you. And that museum so expertly demonstrates the horrors that the Nazis performed against the Jews and the Gypsies and blacks and various other groups. And, at the time, there's a lot of accounts of people saying, that's never going to happen again. We will always remember this. Let's make sure this never happens again. Well, you look between 1945 and 2023, just go onto Wikipedia. I know it's not a trusted source. It's actually become more of a trusted source than it was even 5 years ago. You look at everything that's happened in not even 100 years. The world didn't remember. The world forgot. It has always forgotten. Tragedy will always strike. Atrocities will always be done. We cannot put our faith in humanity, but we must put our faith and our trust in God, because he is the one that carries us through all of those tragedies, carries us through those hard times. And we in our own lives, we want to run from grief, from death, from failure, all of the hard things in life. But what Solomon is doing here in Ecclesiastes is he is wanting us, he is inviting us to look those things straight in the eye and be motivated to look upward, to look at that full and perfect good that God offers. We looked in Revelation, those who overcome. On Revelation 22, let him who thirsts come and drink freely. Do you this morning recognize that you are thirsty? Are you thirsty? Are you thirsty for the God that does, or are you thirsty for the good that God does provide? Because he can provide it. Have you observed the brokenness of this world? Well, as we do always on the first day of the week, and the invitation always stays open, come. Your life is broken. If you observe that and you want to make that right this morning, you need to be baptized. If you need to, you need us, any of us, to help you through life's struggles. Bring God into our lives. Let's remember the goodness that he has done for us. Let's stand as we sing the song that's been selected.